Okay, ladies and gentlemen, the problem we have to solve today is how do we get these two spheres to look like they belong in this scene? How do we get it so they look like they belong in a certain space? Okay, because right now there is no shadow information. That means these two little spheres could be, oh, I don't know, an inch wide if they're up close to the camera, or they could be bigger than that. They could be back. This one could be stuck on a wall. It might not even be a sphere. Maybe it's half a sphere and it's stuck to the wall. We don't know because there is no shadow information. So let's create some shadow information so we can tell the viewer where they stand in space. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hide the sphere above table. We'll do that secondly. And then we're going to select and look at the sphere on the table. So let's make a few assumptions. All right, let's assume that this light is directly above the exact middle of the table. In other words, if I were to draw, oh, let's see, let's get a brush real quick and make it small. If I were to draw or make a pole, and I went straight up from here, that's where the light is. Okay, so that means it's filling in the area evenly. It's centered right above the table. Okay, so I'm going to delete that line, which means the shadow should go evenly from the middle of the sphere out to the right. So how do we know how far that shadow is going to expand? How do we know how big this shadow needs to be? Well, we're going to create some information so we can do this. I'm going to create a new layer just in case. I always like to do this before I use any shape tools. And then I'm going to go get my line tool. Okay, and I've got a fill. We have a stroke. Let's just see what we come up with. So light is directional, right? So let's assume, we know there's a light bulb in here. We can't really see it, but let's assume that the light is emitting straight from about the middle of this light bulb out. So I'm going to draw a line all the way off the canvas and have it just barely touch the edge of that sphere. And then I'm going to create another new layer, and I'm going to start at the same place, and I'm going to draw another line all the way off the table, and so that my line barely touches. Now let's go actually a little bit over that side of the sphere. So now we have information that tells us where the shadow should start and where it should end, because anything inside of these two lines would be in shadow, that shadow being created because the sphere is blocking the light. Okay, and let's make another. Well, this time we're going to use a guide. I'm going to drop a guide down from my rulers up here, right at the base of that sphere, right through about the middle of that table. I'm also going to create two more guides. So one that goes straight up and down vertically from where that first guide crosses this line, and then I'm going to do one where the other guide crosses the other line. Approximately, that's close enough. Okay, now that will again help us determine where to start and end our shadow. Okay, and there's more than one way to create this shadow, especially for a sphere. But because it's round, of course, we can use the ellipse tool. So I'm going to grab the ellipse tool. I'm going to look at the fill color. We don't want it orange, but we can make it orange for now. Why not? Let's do that. And then I'm going to go up over here. I'm going to go up to about, again, I'm looking at about half of the distance, about a line right here, half the distance between this guide and the back of the table. And I'm also going to make it about half the distance between this line and the front of the table. So again, that's where I'm going to start. Again, I'm looking at this line, sort of theoretical line right here. I'm going to start right on that guide that I created, maybe a little lower. And I'm going to left click, drag, and I'm going to go over to that other vertical guide I made and bring that line down a little bit. And then we're going to have this orange fill in. Okay, obviously we don't want that. We need to change that to black, or even better yet, we can change that fill to a gradient. All right, and now our gradient doesn't look really good right now, so let's do a gradient in the next one. I forgot. I'm sorry. We're going to do a black fill here and click out here in negative space to lock that in. All right. The other thing we need to do is obviously the shadow should be below the ball or in between the sphere and the table. So I'm going to drag my layer 3 down below that sphere, and we're going to put it right there. All right, and that in and of itself does not look great. So let me hide these so we can see it a little more clearly. I can also go to View, Show Guides, or the hotkey is Control semicolon, which I use quite a bit. And then I'm going to click on on the table, which says light, but it's the light in the table. And we're going to look at it. And at first you might think that looks pretty good, but I can tell you it's not very good because the edges are too hard, first of all. Also, understand that light bounces, right? So light would be going from this light source off the wall and show up a little bit and lighten up this shadow here a little bit, similarly to this side. And then we can assume there are other things in this room where light would bounce off. Light actually bounces off this table and up into the sphere over here, which would also create bounce off the sphere into the shadow, and that's all very complex, but there's bounce light all over the place in rooms, mostly depending on surfaces. So what we're going to do with this one is we're going to right click and we're going to rasterize it. All right, and then we are going to blur it a little bit. So I'm going to go to filter, blur, Gaussian blur. We don't want it too much. We want it just a little bit. And I'm going to say, okay, that looks pretty good. And then we're going to take the opacity down a little bit. The problem when we do it this way and we have the opacity down is we lose that contact shadow. Okay, you guys should have learned yesterday with that egg video that there is such a thing called a contact shadow. And usually, excuse me, what that means is very little, if any, light gets right where objects make contact with other surfaces. So in order to do it correctly, as far as using the ellipse tool like we did, I'm actually going to bring my opacity all the way back up. I'm going to zoom way in, and I am going to create a mask. Okay, and with that mask, I'm going to get a brush. I'm going to make it pretty big. In this case, I'll give you a number. Let's do 45. And let's make the hardness super small. Actually, let's go up to about 55, 60, 55. Close enough. 57, 56. Good enough. Okay, and now what we want to do is make sure we have black and white over here. So again, I'm going to hit the D for default, and then I'm going to switch it from black to white in the foreground. And now we have to be very careful. And I'm actually going to go behind the ball, and I'm going to start painting. And you'll see that when I do that, it all goes away, which is not good, right? So that looks sort of silly, right? Because all that bounce light wouldn't get in there. So we can't do that. What we can do is use, let's try I don't know, let's start at a 80% opaque brush. So this setting up here will allow us to paint only at 80%. And so if I do it this way, it's also too much. I meant to go the other way. Let's make it 20%. That looks awful too. Control Z. Let's make this 20%. Very quickly. And now this should work. We start painting away, and I'm being very careful with the edge of my brush so that I don't go directly underneath my sphere, and I'm going around it in a circle-like pattern because I'm trying to leave a dark patch underneath there. And I never let go of the mouse button, because as soon as you do and then you left click again, look what happens. It takes it away by 20% more again. All right, so I'm going to leave it sort of at that. Let's look at it. That's a little better. We've got a little contact shadow there, and we've got a shadow all the way across there. Okay, so I'm going to hide that, and we are going to do this another way. Let's show this stuff again. Let's also bring back our guides, view, show, guide. And now let's get the ellipse tool again, all right? And this time, rather than making an oval, I'm actually just going to make a circle. So I'm going to start again at this left, and it doesn't matter if you do this on the table yet because we're going to transform it in a little bit to make it fit. But I want to go up here. I want to go to make it the correct width, and now I'm going to hold down Shift. When I hold down Shift, it creates a perfect circle, and I'm just going to go from guide to guide approximately. Again, doesn't have to be perfect, just get it close. And now I have that sphere. In fact, I can move that thing out of here so we can really see what's going on. And now, if I have my tool selected and I go to Fill by Gradient, you'll see that, unfortunately, we can't see it. Let's move it over here so we can see. All right, back to Fill, Gradient. You can see I have blacks here. And I've moved this slider here, which is opacity. Okay, so these top two squares are opacity. This one we have it 100% so that the black will show up. And when I move that, it doesn't matter because this one, I have my opacity at 0. Both of my colors, you can see, are black. All right. So I'm just going to leave it at like that and click OK. So that's what we're seeing here, basically. We're seeing a radial gradient from the middle of my, the middle of my ellipse out. And now what we can do, watch what happens though in this, so be careful of this. If I go Edit, Free Transform, then I start scaling this up and down, you'll see that that gradient still stays right in the middle and it really doesn't look very good. Okay, we wanted to lock that in a little bit. Watch what happens when I go super big. So it still stays right in the middle. So I'm going to hit the X because we don't want to do that. So before we start free transforming it, I'm going to right click and rasterize it, and that will lock that in per se. So now if I go to Edit, Free Transform, I can squash this to make it that oval shape again. I can move it, and it is underneath our sphere. I can scale it this way if we want. Well, scale it this way. The problem with this one is there's not a lot of control about where the center of that contact shadow is, which is a problem. Okay, so just understand that going in, that sometimes this will work and sometimes it really won't. We could go in and play with a mask all we want, but that wouldn't work very good either. So I'm just going to leave this here like this so you get the idea of what that way of creating a shadow looks like. All right, and then we're going to do this a third way, just so you know you have options in creating shadows. I'm going to create another brand new layer, and I'm going to get my brush. And with my brush, I'm going to make sure it's 100%. On the hard side, I'm going to make the size as big, as wide as, again, these two guides, this one here and this one here. So I'm going to get it right about in the middle and hit my closed brackets key on my keyboard until it gets to be about that size. That's a little big. I'd rather do this and then scale it up. And I'm just going to left click right here in my new layer. Oops, got my brush at 20% still. So I'm just going to left click right in the middle. Boom, and basically all we're doing is pretty much the same as the first one that we did. But now I can go to Free Transform. I can grab one of the corners and I can hold down Alt Shift and scale up evenly until I'm about to the edge of the two guides. I can do Free Transform again. And by the way, the hotkey for Free Transform is Control Alt T. I can scale it down. And I'm looking again, I'm looking at this line right here being in the middle of the table, and I'm going to scale this one up again a little bit. Double click inside, and now we basically have to do the same thing we did before. The first thing is Filter, Blur, Gaussian Blur. That looks pretty good. And then create a mask, and you know the story from here. So again, I'm going to get my brush and make it smaller, make it soft, and make my opacity 20%. And then I'm going to paint on my all the way around, again leaving that inside that contact shadow alone, trying to keep the edge of my brush away from the very bottom of where the sphere makes contact with the table. If I hide these two guys, we have a pretty good shadow there. It might be a little blurry, but it's good enough for now. And since I'm not using these two shadows, I'm just going to delete them. And then we're going to bring back in the sphere above the table, and I'm going to leave it right where it is. Okay, and again, what we have to do is draw a line so we know how wide to make the shadow, which is very quick, very easy. Get the line tool, go to the middle of the light bulb, draw a line all the way off the canvas is fine to about where it touches the edge of the ball, and then I'm going to do it again from there. Oh, don't go too far, to about right there. And it's funny because I saw that gradient fill in there and it's filling it in with gradient, but we can still see it, so that's good enough. If I really wanted to go in and change the fill to a solid color, I could, but I'm just going to leave that for now. And then what we're going to do is we're just going to duplicate layer 3. So Control J, duplicate our layer. Now I'm going to get my move tool, make sure auto select is not on, and I'm going to hold down, I'm going to left click to select it, then hold down Shift so I can move it in a straight line. The other thing, though, the problem that we have is now our contact shadow is incorrect. So what happens if I can basically go back to my mask? I can paint in with white in the foreground color. I can paint it all back in with my opacity all the way up at 100%, of course. Paint it all back in. Now we have that shadow. The problem is now it's not wide enough, right? And we don't want to scale the thing all the way up. I'm just going to bump it over with my arrow keys. And then I'm going to free transform, Control Alt T, and I'm going to move this out left until that shadow basically touches that line. That's close enough. And I'm going to move this out to the right. Again, so the shadow basically touches that line. Can go a little bit over. Double click and we lock that in. Now what problem do we have? Well, shadows don't just float in air, right? They're not going to stand right over the top of that table. They're going to bend, right? The rest of the shadow would be on the floor way down over here somewhere. So we can't really do anything about that. We have to leave that alone. I'm not worried about the floor with this project anyway. So what we're going to do then is we are going to get rid of the shadow that overlaps the side of the table. Okay, so I'm going to get my polygonal lasso tool because that's what we have for a straight line, and I'm going to draw, click, I'm going to make this straight line, click, and I'm going to go surround that area that we want to get rid of, double click to close that. Now I'm going to go into my mask, I'm going to get my brush again, I'm going to make it black, and I'm going to make it 100%, and I'm just going to paint. Control D to deselect. Now that shadow ends on the table. And again, we can hide our shapes. And that's it for this project. Now we've told everybody, hey, we've got a floating ball here and we've got one sitting on the table here. I guess one thing that we could do is take the opacity down just a little bit on the overall thing. The other thing I like to do sometimes with shadows is multiply them in the blend modes, because sometimes you can get the grain or whatever that shadow is resting on to come through a little bit. All right, so that's it. Make sure you flatten, save as a JPEG, and submit.